Hello and welcome everybody, and hi to chapter 6 of the GraphQL book club. Hi Will, how's it going?
Good. Hey, Alex. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Yeah, excited to get into it.
Exactly. Thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the time and to be with us for the chapter 6 of the GraphQL book club. Before we dive in, we have a raffle again today. So another signed copy of the book. Exactly. Here it is.
This very one.
This very one. This is still unsigned. So if you want your name on it or somebody else's name as a dedication to somebody else, please. And if you watch this now, if you watch this as a recording, sorry, but if you watch it now live with us, then type in !Raffle on either Twitch or YouTube. It's not going to work on other channels, but if you are watching it somewhere else now and you think, oh my god, I want to win, head over. It's relatively easy to watch it on the other outlets. So if you want to win that book for a reason, since with the bot it only works on Twitch and YouTube. So if you want to win, type that in !Raffle. I think it needs to be the only message, not within a message. So Tony, just do !Raffle and nothing else, and then you're in, and not as part of a sentence. And then the bot should pick it up. Sometimes it takes a little bit for entrances to be accepted, but I think, yeah, here we go. Michael has a ticket. And no space. Sorry, Tony. No space between ! And yes, exactly. That's the one. One all in one. All right. So we give this out just before, or we close it just before we do the exercises. So you have a couple of minutes time, and I'll say a few more words to remind everybody. So until then, don't worry.
And if you miss, if you're watching the recording and you missed the live chancel for the raffle, we're going to do this, 3 more times? We're going to raffle 1 copy for each of the next chapters in our book club. So
yeah,
join us live next time for 3 more chances to win.
Exactly. Another chance next week. So hopefully you can win then. And yeah, let's dive in, I guess. So chapter 6, we had a little wrap around to remind everybody what's happening here on the last episode. And today, I guess we can dive in right away. So this is the middle bracket, sort of, if you will, in the book. So we completed the beginner and the intro segment, and which were chapters 1 to 4, and chapters 5 and 6 are more like the application driving platform setup, sort of preparation, I guess, before the final chapters will be actually the application building itself. So we are here at the end of segment 2 before the final segment starts next week. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, if you don't have a copy of the book yet, everyone can download a PDF copy of this book for free, thanks to Neo4j. Now, Alex, if you could drop the link to that in the chat.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So if you're following along, then you know where we are. We're picking up on our React application that we started in chapter 5, so last week. If you're joining for the first time, like Alex said, we already sort of talked a lot about the back end of our application. So we're building a full stack business reviews application. We want to be able to search for businesses. We want to be able to deploy that to the web. We want to see reviews. We need to be able to have things like authorization to make sure that users are able to, say, for example, only edit their reviews. These sorts of things are all considerations that we're thinking about in the context of this full stack GraphQL application. So we have our basic database and GraphQL API up and running. Covered that in part 1. Part 2 is all focused on the front end. So last time in chapter 5, we introduced React. We started from create React app, and we learned a few important concepts of React, how we deal with data in our components. I guess, first of all, understanding this idea that React components are composable. We can combine them together to build more powerful user interfaces. And thinking about how we work with data in React, both in props, which is sort of read-only data that we can pass through to our component hierarchy, and then state. So components have state data that can be updated and trigger re-renders, sort of thinking about as a user is moving through your application, how does that state change? So we talked about that last time. This time in chapter 6, we are going to focus on client-side data fetching with Apollo Client. We also introduce GraphQL mutations along the way, so that'll be fun. Previously, we've only been working with queries, so fetching data rather than updating data in the database. So we talk a bit about Apollo Client here. So Apollo Client allows us to sort of make it easier for fetching data from our GraphQL API within a React application. And I should say Apollo Client, there are implementations for lots of different front-end frameworks, as well as native versions for iOS and Android. We're focused on React in this book, so that is the only sort of flavor of Apollo clients that we touch on. So one of the big benefits of Apollo Client is sort of giving you a idiomatic way of working with data depending on the framework that you're using. So we're using React. We talked about hooks briefly in the last chapter where we're looking at the use state hooks. This is sort of a functional way of working with state data, and the Apollo client flavor for React gives us hooks, so functions in React to work with fetching data from our GraphQL server. And you can see in this diagram, also one of the big benefits of Apollo client is the cache. So rather than going back to the server to fetch data for every operation in our front-end application, Apollo client can cache data so that that's read locally from the client cache without sending another request to the server. So that benefits us for performance. Along the way, we talk about some things like adding GraphQL variables. So I don't think we've touched on GraphQL variables in the book before. This is useful for, if you remember, we had this select business category dropdown. And so what we want to do is by defining a variable, or other languages call these parameters, similar to a parameter in Cypher, but in GraphQL we call it a variable. So here on page 124 here in this code snippet, you can see we are defining the GraphQL query that is going to fetch businesses based on some selected category, and that selected category is coming from that drop down of different options, but we've defined a variable so that we can just pass the same query along with an object that has the value of that variable when we are ready to fetch some data. And so you can see here down below where we are actually using the get business query, we are passing along the selected category variable as well, right here. We also, let's see, we touch on caching with Apollo Client, some different ways of sort of refetching data if we want to kind of override what's in the cache, something to think about after we execute mutations, which is the subject of the next section of the book. So we talked about a lot about the generated query API. So we're using the Neo4j GraphQL library here to handle a lot of our GraphQL work. And so the basic way the Neo4j GraphQL library works is we define some GraphQL type definitions, and we hand that off to the Neo4j GraphQL library, which goes through and generates all of the API entry points and operations for searching for data. So we saw a lot of the generated filter function, but it also generates the operations for create, update, and delete operation, both for nodes and relationships. And so mutations, those are going to be our create, update, and delete operations. So in this chapter, we introduce the generated mutations, so things for creating nodes. So in this example here, we are creating a new business, a coffee shop, using the generated create business mutation. So we cover the various options for updating data, creating relationships, and so on that are generated by the Neo4j GraphQL library. So that's an important piece of the GraphQL spec and GraphQL functionality to understand. And then in the last section in this chapter, we talk about client state management with GraphQL. And this one I think is really interesting. Basically, the idea here is to combine the state for our application with our GraphQL API and our server fetch data. So to combine those together, so we really just have sort of a single interface for data now in our application, whether it's server data or client state data. And by client state data, I guess I mean the state of our application as a user is going through it. So the example we have here is we are giving the user some ability to star or like favorite some businesses. Maybe it would be something like sorting the order of a table view or something like that. It's not data that we necessarily need to send back to the server, but data that we do need to keep track of because it deals with how our application or how our view is rendered. And there's lots of different ways of dealing with client state in React in general. Working with what are called local only fields in Apollo Client is one way of handling client state management. And the basic idea here is we can add fields to our GraphQL schema. So here on the right in this code snippet, we're adding a is starred field to the business type. So this means when we fetch our list of businesses, alongside the information that comes from the server, like the address, the categories of this business, reviews of the business, and so on, we can now also add data that lives locally in the client about whether or not the user has starred, in this case, that business. So just a way to simplify working with both server and client data in our React application. So I think those are the basic concepts that we want to talk about. We can see here at query time how we leverage these local only fields. We add the client directive. We've seen directives before on the server side. So GraphQL schema directives where we were configuring the generated GraphQL API, we were adding custom logic with the Cypher directive, these sorts of things. This, I guess, is our first client directive where we are, or query directive rather, where we are passing this directive in a GraphQL operation. So directives are very useful both in our schema and in our queries. Cool. So those are the basic concepts that we talked through. I think we can, maybe before we jump to the exercises, maybe we'll get our app up and running and look at the code here. So maybe that's one last call for joining the raffle before we jump to the exercises.
Yeah, let's do that. One last chance. If you have not done so, type _Raffle in either the Twitch or the YouTube chat, and you get a ticket for the raffle, and you can win the book we are talking about actually in this book club, signed by Will, and dedicated to you or dedicated to somebody else if you like. So yeah, is open. It's up. We are about to close it soon. So if you haven't done so, do it now.
Cool. So a couple more minutes. We'll take in entries for the raffle. So let's take a look at the code where we ended up. Make sure we can get our application up and running, and then we'll come back and work through these 3 exercises. Yeah, we'll go from there. So let's take a look at the code. So first, let's see. Sure we have our app up and running. No. Let's see. So I have, okay, I have the GraphQL API up and running. So we need the React app. Okay, so we'll do run start. So this is going to start our React application, which is going to query our GraphQL API that's already up and running. Cool, and we can see this looks familiar from last time. So pretty simple UI here. We have a drop-down to select business by category, which we had last time. So if you remember for chapter 5, when we were just starting out with our Create React app, we sort of hard-coded some fake data, and we were just reading that data from a JSON object. Now we have replaced that with fetching data via GraphQL. So if I take a look in app.js here, we see our GraphQL query. So we are looking for businesses that are connected to a category. We are bringing back some information about the business. And then we have our local only client field is starred. And that is starred enables us to click the star button. And now our starred or our favorites list are in bold. And we can see as we change the drop down, we get back businesses within the category that we're looking for. Although I think I was playing around with this and I think I added restaurant. What did we do here? Oh yeah, I added restaurant and breakfast inadvertently to every single business. But that's okay. You can still see this working. Library and car wash.
That's a breakfast car wash. Of course it is.
That's not a bad idea. I mean, get your breakfast while you get your car wash.
Yeah, maybe. Have a breakfast inside your car while it's, inside the car wash. I don't know.
Yeah, if you're eating in your car, you should definitely do it before the car wash, not the after. Maybe that's how they guarantee repeat business. Serve you food inside your clean car.
Oh, it's dirty again. How come?
Yeah, so we'll fix that one. You might be seeing something different locally, but you get the idea. So what have we done here? So in the code, we see our GraphQL query. We see our friend here, the selected category state variable, And now we are pulling in the use query. This is a hook that comes from Apollo client. And basically the way this works is when this component is rendered, we will execute the get business query, which will then go through a few different states. So there may be an error state that the GraphQL endpoint is down. Maybe we have an error in our API. Whatever happens, we can't render any data. Or we may have a loading state. And in that case, we just show a little loading. You could show a spinner or something like that. But in the case where we have data, then we render our business category dropdown, and we pass data.businesses, so the result of our businesses, onto this business results component. I think we didn't touch this component, I don't think, much, except to add the star button, I think is really the only thing we changed here. So that's a good way of showing that the business search logic is independent of this business results component. It's one of the nice things about creating our app in components is business results. It's only responsible for figuring out how to show a list of results. Doesn't care where that data comes from. We have that logic elsewhere. Cool. So I think that is a basic look at the code. Let's just look at one more file here. We saw this in the book, but just to tie this all together, this is index.js. So this is how we are configuring Apollo client. So we create a new instance of Apollo client and point it at our GraphQL URL. In this case, it's running locally. When we deploy this, we'll have to think about setting this with environment variables, but for now, we're just hard coding that. We need to specify the type of cache that we're using. The default is this in-memory cache, but we could have other types of caches as well. If we were using, say, for example, the iOS version, we might use something like SQLite or something to persist that.
Mm-hmm.
But here we're also defining the is starred local field. And the book talks about this. I didn't go through this when we were just looking through the examples in the book, but we're combining this with a what's called reactive variable called, here we're calling it star_var. And this is a nice feature of Apollo client that gives us this variable that we can update, and when the value of that changes, in this case the starred var, when that value changes, then we automatically re-render any components that are dependent on that variable, which is why it is reactive. So we have our Apollo client instance, and we just inject it into the React component hierarchy here with the Apollo provider component. So that allows us to use the functions, the hooks for working with GraphQL data anywhere in any of our components within our React application.
Cool. All right, I guess we're ready for the raffle before we dive into the exercises of chapter 6. So if you haven't done so, I think you will have to look at winning next time because I'm going to close the entries in 3, 2, 1 now. All right, so we have a couple of participants. So drum roll, and here we go. William is our winner.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, William Rivera del Carpio. Congratulations on winning. Anybody else that hasn't won, sorry. As Bill said, we will do this until the end of this book club, which will be chapter 3 in so 3 more episodes. William, congratulations. Please send me an email, and I will put my email details in chat, so you can send me the email there with your address. And if you would like to dedicate this book to somebody else, then please also send it in that email, and then we will get it ready for you. So congratulations, William.
Great, fun. So now we are ready to work through the exercises. So we have 3 exercises here for chapter 6. Let's just work through these. So the first one is talking about GraphQL fragments. So what other GraphQL fragments could we use across our application? When would it make sense to use multiple fragments in the same query? Yeah, so let's jump to the section of the book where we talk about this, which is 6.1.4. So I think I skipped over this as we were going through the review of the concepts of the chapter, but fragments are an important one. So similarly to GraphQL variables, fragments are something that are useful when we're building our application. We don't typically see fragments used when we're doing like testing and development with things like GraphQL Playground or in Graphical. We typically kind of omit using these, but they're very, very useful functions when we are building our applications. So GraphQL fragments basically allow us to address reusability and this concept of don't repeat yourself, which is important in programming. And so the basic idea of a fragment is it allows us to define a piece of a selection set. So here you can see we're defining a fragment here. Zoom in. Yeah,
let's zoom in a little bit. Yeah.
There we go. So we declare this is a fragment called business details on the business type, and here are the fields, the sort of subset of a selection set that are contained within the business details fragment. When we define this fragment, we can then reference the business details fragment within a GraphQL query. And this is then useful because let's say we have different views in our application that depend on the details of a business, right? This is probably going to be the case. And so as we update maybe we add a new field to our business type, we add a new view somewhere in the details we're showing about a business, and we're fetching that data in multiple components, multiple places in our application. Well, we want to make sure that new field is available and is fetched in all those different cases where we're fetching business details. If we've defined a fragment, we just add that to the fragment. And then any of the queries that we're using the fragment, that field is then included. So this is good, can help us avoid some common errors where we're omitting fields or things like that by instead using a fragment. So you can see here how we're using the fragment just by including the fragment name in the selection set. Here, we're only using the business details fragment. We're not including any other fields in our selection set. So that's the basic idea of fragments. Useful for these sorts of cases. We can use multiple fragments in one query. Imagine the case where perhaps we have some user information that we want to bring back alongside our business details, but we're not always including that business information. Maybe it'd be nice to include that in a fragment, so we can choose when to include those 2 different selection sets. So cool, pretty useful feature, GraphQL fragments. Exercise number 2, we're talking about GraphQL mutations. So this says add the newly created Phil's Coffee business, which is an example we saw in the book. So we'll add that business to our API. But the exercise is to add the restaurant and breakfast categories to Phil's Coffee. So let's first take a look at the mutation to add that to the business, or add the business rather. 6.2. Yeah, let's just copy this here. So here's our mutation to add Phil's Coffee. Let's jump over to, let's do this in Apollo Studio. So our GraphQL API is running on localhost 4000. And here's the mutation that I just copied from the book. And we'll zoom in a little bit. Maybe one more. Yeah, there we go. So this is Apollo Studio, the sandbox environment, which is one of the sort of in-browser tools that we use to query our GraphQL API. And I guess this is the first mutation that we've seen. So with mutations, we need to add this mutation keyword at the beginning. By default, everything is a query. So this could also be query or subscription. Query we can leave off. I think we've done that in a few cases, but mutation we need to specify. This is a mutation operation. And then the Nearby GraphQL library generates by default mutation operations for each type. So here we are using the create business mutation, and we're passing in the details of the business. So this is Phil's Coffee in San Mateo, one of my favorite coffee shops. We're going to add that and then return some information about the business we created. And cool, here it is, Phil's Coffee in San Mateo. If we go back to our application, even if we hit the refetch button, we'll see though that this Phil's Coffee business doesn't show up, which may be unexpected. But if we take a look at the GraphQL query here in app.js, and we'll zoom in a bit. The query that we're running has this filter, so this where category sum and the category name contains the selected category. So in the case where we've selected all, we're just passing a blank string, but as you can see here, the value in the form is just a blank string. So this basically will find all businesses connected to a category, but our Phil's Coffee business is not connected to a category. Therefore, it's not one of these businesses that comes back from our business search. So we need to fix that. We need to add Phil's Coffee to the restaurant. What did you say? Restaurant and cafe, or was it restaurant and breakfast?
I think it was restaurant and breakfast.
Restaurant and breakfast. Okay, cool.
Yep.
Let's do that then. So we can look at the documentation. So if we go into the documentation for the Nearby GraphQL library in the mutations section, we can see a lot more information about the generated mutations. One way that we can create a relationship, so what we want to do is we have the Phil's Coffee business node, and we already have nodes for the restaurant category, and the breakfast category. So we don't want to create a new node. We want to create relationships connecting them. Now, the create mutations are generated for the types. So we have create business, create category. For adding a relationship, we can use the update operations. So let's go back to Apollo Studio and get a little more screen space here. And so we're going to execute a mutation. We'll do the update businesses mutation. And then in the selection set, let's bring back, sure, the business name and the categories. Make sure that we added Phil's Coffee to the right ones, to the right categories here. And so in our update businesses mutation, well, first of all, we want to make sure that we're only applying this update to Phil's Coffee. So we're going to add a where filter here. In Apollo Studio wants to use these GraphQL variables. I'm going to switch to inline variables, so I still get my nice autocomplete in here. But basically what we're going to do here is filter. We could filter by name, but there may be other Phil's Coffees. So because we have this business ID, let's use that value. So for business ID of B10, we're going to apply these updates. And what are the updates going to be? Well, basically, we want to connect. And again, I'm going to switch back to inline variables here. And what we want to connect are categories where the node is, the name of the node is either restaurant or breakfast. And I can combine these in an OR array here, which is quite nice. So we're going to say where the name of the category is restaurant, or the name of the category is breakfast. Mm-hmm. And let's format that to make it a little more readable. Format operation, there we go. So update businesses, which business? The one with business ID B10, and connect. So connect means create relationships connecting any node, any business nodes that match this predicate, where the business ID is B10, and where the category nodes are either restaurant or breakfast. So we should create two relationships here connecting Phil's Coffee to the breakfast and restaurant category. And we can see in our response, that's what we show here. So now Phil's Coffee is connected to breakfast and restaurant category. If we go back to our app and we hit refetch, now we get Phil's Coffee in the restaurant and breakfast category, along with all of our other businesses. Cool. So that was exercise 2, talking about mutations. And we've got one more, which is dealing with the star button. So currently, the star button, we can click once to star or favorite the business. But if we click it a second time, nothing happens. And that's because the logic in our React app is only covering the case where we're starring something, not unstarring it. Mm-hmm. And so what we want to do is now turn this star button into a toggle. So if the business is already starred, then we need to remove it from the starred list. so that it should no longer be bold in the table. So let's see how to do that. We are going to want to go to business results component. And let's take a look at how this works currently. So we have the is starred field. So remember, this is starred. This is our local only field. This is the one that has the client directive. We can go back to app.js to see this. Right here, this is starred client field. So this data is not coming from the server. This is our client state data that we're working with. And if we go back to index.js where we set this up, we can see that the is starred field is a Boolean, and it's going to be whether or not the starred var, so this is a array of business IDs, it's a reactive variable managed by Apollo client. If that array contains the business ID of the currently resolved business. So just a Boolean, is it starred, yes or no? That is now available to us in our business results component with this is starred. And so in the case where it is starred, we show it in bold. And the logic for this button, so the onClick handler, when we click the button, executes this function, which is basically to take our current starred items and create a new array. We spread out the starred items and then add the ID of whichever business we click the starred button for to our reactive variable to add it to our list of starred businesses. But we need to now change this so that if it is already starred, then we need to remove it from this starred var array. So we're going to change some of the logic of our event handler here. So let's keep this as an anonymous JavaScript function here, but we need some more lines. So we'll add a few more semicolons. So the basic idea here is to toggle the starred item. So first you need to see if the item is starred, then we're going to remove the business ID from the starred var array. And otherwise, that means that it's not starred, then we need to add the business ID to the starred var array. We have the logic for that. That's just this right here. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say is b starred. So if b.is starred, then the value for the starred var is going to be what? Well, we could do a filter operation here. So another thing to keep in mind is that we're not checking to see if the business ID is already in the array when we click the star button. So it could be the case that anytime we click the button, we're adding multiple instances of the same business ID.
Okay. Right.
So that's one thing to think of. But we'll just do a filter operation over the starred items dot filter. So this basically will iterate over each of the values in our starred items array which is our array of business IDs. And we'll just check to see if the business ID does not match the business ID of the button of the business we've clicked the button for, then we won't include it. So we'll filter over those. We'll say where I is not equal to the business ID. And then that will be the case for if the item is starred. Otherwise, well, then we're just going to add it to the array here, which we already had. Cool. Let's save that. And let's refresh our application and let's see if this works. So we should be able to click a business to star it and click it again to unstar it. And looks like that works. So that is how we can turn that star button into a toggle just working with local only variables. The is starred variable here is a local only field in our GraphQL schema now, but that is managed by Apollo client. And I should say that that data is stored in the cache, the local in-memory cache, alongside the cached data from the server. So it's just a nice way of having one interface of dealing with now application data, whether it's your server fetch data or your local client data. I see a question in the chat.
Exactly. Yeah.
From Misha. Do you want to read it for us?
I can read it. Yes, from Misha. And I can also put it up on the screen here. How to make the query to show all businesses even when there is no category connected.
Yeah, great question. So we touched on that a little bit. So remember, we added the Phil's Coffee business, but it didn't show up in our table. And we said the reason for that is because it includes this where filter that's connected to at least one category with a name, and that we said when we select all categories, we just pass a blank string, which is just basically checking that there is some category relationship that exists, but not checking the value of the category name. So one thing we could do is we could check, go back to our Apollo studio here. One thing we could do is in the client check to see, have we actually selected a category? If we haven't, then just don't include the where argument. And so in that case, we would just fetch all businesses. So it would look something like this. We bring back name, address, categories, something like this. And in this case, we would get back an empty array for categories. I don't think we have any businesses now that aren't connected to categories, but we would have seen Phil's Coffee show up in here, and then we would have had just an empty array for categories because there are no category nodes that it's connected to. And then we'd have to think about how to handle that in the table. Maybe we just don't show anything in the table, and so on. But yeah, so a few different ways to handle that case. So yeah, good question.
Thank you for that question, Misha.
Cool. So I think, was that it for the exercise that is that we covered all 3 exercises. We covered some of the main points in the chapter, which just to touch on again, we talked about how to add Apollo client to an existing React application that we built in the previous chapter. We talked about the cache, how Apollo client will cache data for us. We talked about how to work with GraphQL variables and fragments. We talked a little bit about how to refetch data from the server when we don't want to read it from the cache. We talked about GraphQL mutations. We saw how to create nodes, how to create and update relationships. And then we talked about how to handle client state management with GraphQL and Apollo client by using local only fields. So fields that we add to the our schema that don't exist on the server. That's just data that we can query from the local cache, but gives us one smooth interface for working with data in our application. So that's what we covered this time. Next time in chapter 7, we're going to do a deep dive on authorization and authentication with some of the built-in functionality in the Neo4j GraphQL library and Auth0. I think this is the longest chapter in the book, so there's a lot of interesting cases to consider around authorization.
Okay, so maybe a little longer episode next time. We have one more question from Peter. I guess we can do that one. Are categories better than properties for some activities?
Yeah. So if maybe we can look at our database to answer this question. So let's just get some businesses up on the screen. So we are storing some information about each business. So we have things like address, the ID of the business, its location, and so on. But we're not storing the category of the business as a property. Instead, we have these category nodes to define the category. So here's Hanabi, this ramen restaurant. It is connected to the restaurant category and the ramen category. And so this is kind of a fundamental question when we're talking about graph data modeling is, should something be a property of the node, or should we move that out into its own node to represent? And the question I always ask myself when trying to figure this out is there something useful that I could discover, some use case where querying through the value as a node onto another node gives me value versus storing it as a property on the restaurant node? And in this case, the answer is yes, because I can, for example, traverse through the category nodes to find other businesses that have overlapping categories. Perhaps that's like part of a recommendation query or something like that. Whereas if I stored that as a property on the node, I wouldn't be able to do that sort of traversal from the restaurant to the category to other restaurants with overlapping categories. So that's largely why we chose to model category as its own node here, rather than as property on the business node.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, it's always like the discussion we see on how to model it, property inside a node, or does it become its own node for its own right? It's I guess it's one way. You can start doing it the one way, and then when you realize, okay, actually this should have been maybe a a separate node because now what you just described is making more sense for me because I want to give recommendations. You can always change it again. So that's what's the beauty and the ease of working with graphs with Neo4j is that you can refactor this after the fact that you've done it. But then if you do it, in the first place and think about it, is this a question? Is this important? Is this, and this hints at Michael's question, I guess, would that help with performance? Of course, if you have a node separately instead of a property because it is a category like a recommendation, then that can improve your performance because the graph database engine doesn't have to look into each and every node in your database to see what properties there are. But if you just have, okay, ramen, I want only ramen restaurants, then it goes to the category node ramen and then gives you all the nodes that are connected to that category node and doesn't have to look at all the restaurants if they are property ramen or no. So that is indeed quicker. But if that is not a query you ask or you want to run oftentimes, then it's maybe not as important, and then it can be a property as well.
Yeah, graph data modeling, I think, is really an iterative process that we either know all the questions we want to ask ahead of time, and that can then inform the model, or as we're experimenting with our data, we come across new questions that we want to ask of the data, and perhaps we don't have quite the best graph model to answer those questions, which then we may want to change our data model. So it's, I think, a bit of an art based on the data that we have and really what questions we plan to ask of the data. In this case, those questions are largely driven from the business requirements of our application, but it may be the case that it's more exploratory if it's more of a data science-y type project where we're sort of exploring and trying to uncover interesting uses of the data. Maybe we don't know those questions ahead of time and we need a more sort of iterative, call it an experiential approach to graph data modeling, which is totally fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And it helps, along the way, in particular, that okay, if you don't have to set everything in stone right at the beginning, you can say, okay, we start here and then we go, and then let's see what comes up, what business needs might be added on, or what we discover during this, and then we see, okay, actually, this if we change it, the model to this, then we have a better way of doing it, and it makes it easier to work with. So we can change it on the way.
Totally.
So yeah, but that's art is probably a good word. Science sounds too heavy. It's a little bit of a getting to know how to work with it, getting to know how to what makes sense, what doesn't, what's a better way to operate is a little bit of a a learning exercise, I guess. But yeah, it's fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. I think that's brings us to the end of this episode. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week again for chapter 7 with the GraphQL book club. It's the same time as today, same day actually, Wednesday, 18th of January. In the meantime, if you are interested in other Neo4j streams, Michael and I will be back on Monday. We had to skip this week, but we'll be back on Monday morning. Jesus and I will be back Monday afternoon for Going Meta episode 12. So that's the full year episode, first year finished, complete. So that's going to be fun. And on Tuesday, I have Tom Essel join me to talk about how to do Wardley maps with Neo4j. So I think that's gonna be a full week next week. Lots of streams, lots of video content. So if that's something you're interested in, join any of those or all of them. I'd be happy to have you there. And yeah, with that, the link to the events page, yes, neo4j.com/events. There you find all the events that are taking place online and offline around Neo4j. Very easy, and then you can find find them all there. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Will, again for taking us through the chapter 6 and for obviously explaining the exercises. And yeah, thank you everybody for watching, and have a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody.
See you next time. Cheers.
Bye.